Currently, I'm writing a book entitled A Narrow Road from the Interior, and this is a book about my travels from 2010 onwards, across Asia, different parts of the world. And the title is shamelessly taken from a masterpiece travelogue from the 18th century poet, Basho, Narrow Road to the Interior. In fact, a couple months ago, I was with Arnie Psyche at an Irish pub, just downing pints of Guinness. And I was asking him, Arnie, what book do you read to get yourself going? And when he told me it was Basho's A Narrow Road to the Interior, I said, that's the book I'm plagiarizing. Well, Basho's vision was actually go to the interior, which was basically the provinces, the ruler part of Japan. It was a travel of meditation, because he was also a Zen priest, a travel of poetry. But in my case, it's from the interior for a number of reasons. One is I lived in the Midwest for over 10 years until recently, and we call the Midwest the interior. And for me, the interior, having lived there for over 10 years, I live in a town called Toledo, Ohio, which is close to Detroit. It's got a miniature version of this industrial wasteland. And I'm not using that metaphorically. For example, yesterday, a gentleman was talking about the machine, the capitalist machine, how that kills human beings. Well, that literally happened in Toledo when I was there, when an auto worker, central industry in Toledo is Daimler Chrysler at the time, and a Cuban-American worker was ordered to go into a shop where there was these robots, sped up over the safety standards, and there was a safety switch was turned off, and he was caught, and he was chopped in half, and he died. And a couple years down the road, another worker who was harassed on the job, who was not allowed to take even a piss break, a bathroom break, he took a shotgun to work and went postal, killed his managers and offed himself. So that was kind of a place that I was living in. And I went there to work with Peter Linebaugh, who is a great scholar of the commons. Peter worked with Edward Thompson during the 1970s. Edward was a great campaigner against nuclear weapons in the 80s. And the Guardian said he was one of the people who ended the Cold War through his activism. Well, E.P. Thompson and Peter and other people in Warwick in England decided to study what the commons was in relation to the English social history. Because the first industrial revolution, the first capitalist regime in its classical mode, took place in England. And the English indigenous, the peasants, the commoners, they faced enclosure. Their lands were taken away, the customary rights were enclosed and privatized. And in the process, they appealed to the traditional rights of the commons and reinvented it into a culture of rebellion. So for Thompson, for Linebaugh, my teachers, this was not just an academic history. It was a history that was living in the moment. Rosa was talking about the West Papua in the prison system. Well, Peter worked with prisoners in Attica and other places to refuel his imagination into writing his masterpiece, London Hanged, which is a history of the capital punishment. So I had these ideas in my head when I was traveling through Japan from 2010 all the way until the present. And I got to tell you, when I went to Japan in November 2010, I actually was a little disappointed because I went to this great protest against TPP in Yokohama. And it was really interesting because a lot of people from different parts of the world, Korea, the Ainu people of Hokkaido, Okinawan people were there. And it was potentially very productive, but there was not much of a dialogue. And when the demo took place, it was the first time I went to a Japanese demo, there was heavy regulation. We couldn't move. We were walking down the street and the police outnumbered us, and we couldn't go on the sidewalk, we couldn't get into traffic. We were like completely suffocated. And I had blisters on my feet. I didn't know anybody. I felt completely isolated. And all these bystanders were looking at us like we were a bunch of weirdos. And the right-wingers were also marching. And despite the nonsense that they were spewing forth, they had the better speeches. So I felt really, really disappointed. And I had to go to the bathroom. So I took a bathroom break myself. And when I came out, everybody was gone. So I felt alone. Well, within 6 months, that changed completely. A lot of things happened, as you recall. The Arab Spring, which brought a new energy from Tahrir Square all the way to Syntagma Square in Greece, where general strike took place. There was, struggles in Madrid, in Chile, and also after 3/11, the great tsunami, the nuclear disaster. This demonstration culture that I mentioned changed instantaneously. People who never participated in demonstration actually came to the demos and far exceeded the expectations of the organizers. And the police couldn't regulate them. And they were dancing and singing in complete beautiful chaos on the streets. And at the same time, there are people, just ordinary folks who never studied science, who start to study nuclear science, who started to study radioactive science and took Geiger counters to the streets and started measuring things and had research collectives because the government was denying that there was any problem at all. It wasn't really telling the truth. So they had to actually measure these things themselves. And, I remember after all these big demos in Tokyo going to Busan. As you recall, yesterday there was a documentary about the Korean War, the central place of the divide between North and South. And in Busan, this was September of 2011, I remember going to a huge demo. This was in solidarity with a waterfront worker who cooped herself up in the crane. And this was even bigger than the demos I went to in Japan. This was, it was like raining cats and dogs. And yet, people turned up in tens of thousands of people. There were concerts, there were poetry, there were people out in the streets, there were people just getting wet, but still didn't care. And I remember Lee Jin-gyun, the co-founder of this research collective, Suyu Nomo, he told me, and Lee Jin-gyun was actually an activist during the 1980s for the democratization movement. He was jailed and he studied yoga, and he's still teaching yoga at this collective. And he told me, look at these handicapped people, people in wheelchairs. They're the most discriminated in Korea, and we actually study with them. We read Marx, we read Foucault, Deleuze. So they're not only the most best educated, they're the most militant. Out in the demos, they put their bodies on the front line. They don't care if they're beaten. And you look at the Trotskyists there, who are divided everywhere in the rest of the world. In South Korea, they're the most united. And their children, their parents, all kinds of people. And I remember, as we were in front of the police barricade, this voice resonated through the streets, this huge voice. And I don't speak or understand a word of Korean, but it was mesmerizing. It was intoxicating. And I kept asking, who is this guy? And nobody knew who it was. And later I found out that it was probably some anonymous worker, a local worker, because there's a tradition of public oratory, of speaking in public and turning into a music. Even if you don't understand it, it can intoxicate your mind. And these thoughts were on my mind because it was just right across the channel, Japan. I went to, just right after that in September, I went to Okinawa. And I remember, the demos in Japan, in Tokyo, have really exploded, but it was nothing like Korea. How come we, even though it's so close, why can't we have this energy, shared amongst us? And these thoughts were in my head when I went to this little island called Iejima off of Okinawa. And Ie Island is very important historically because it's the place where the peace movement started after World War II in Japan. Hagon Shoko, this great landlord who saw his lands being taken away, the subsistence economy being destroyed by military occupation by the Americans, decided to do a tremendous, powerful, organize a movement against it. And there's a solidarity house, a place where people come and share their stories. And no less moving was, on this island, was a cave where a collective suicide took place right at the end of World War II. Now, Hideki, yesterday, taught us that the Battle of Okinawa shattered the Okinawans. And one of the shattering experiences was these collective suicides that took place in these caves. Pressured by the Japanese military. The natives, the indigenous Okinawans, were forced to commit suicide. And this great thinker, writer, from Okinawa, Okamura Keitoku. He wrote about these collective suicides. And he asked a question, because often the narrative was these people were basically just devoted to the emperor or the military, and that's why they killed themselves. But he said that's not the case. The fact is, these people, they didn't want to see their families. The idea was, if their families were dead, their villagers, fellow villagers were dead, the idea of themselves, just one person themselves surviving, was unbearable. I mean, this is in a way the collective, the commons, acting on itself. And it's a very tragic story, but it's very different, he said, from the idea that the individual matters than anybody else, than the collective. That the individual can survive at the expense of the collective. So when I was reading this passage, I was thinking of Toni Morrison's Beloved, where the slave woman, if you remember the story, kills her own child because the experiences she had, being traumatized by being raped, being brutalized by slavery, was unbearable for her to have it experienced by her own child. So this kind of thought, was really resonating in me when I was reading Okamoto. And Okamoto talks about another writer who's really important in Okinawa, who's a very active, a short story writer, a man by the name of Medoruma Shun. And Medoruma writes about, these stories about Okinawa, despite the fact that he didn't experience the war himself, but he knows people, his parents, his grandparents. And Okamoto points out that the reason he can do this so vividly is because he listens very intently to those family histories, family stories. And one example that Medoruma talks about is when he talks about his grandmother going in the 1920s, late 20s, to this textile factory in Kanagawa, where she was working as a factory girl, but she decided to go sightseeing with other friends to the imperial palace. And because she was so devoted to the Japanese emperor, she wanted to see the emperor in person. So she said to the guard, "Get the emperor here so I can say hi." And the guard completely brushed her off. And she was so irritated because she came all the way from Okinawa. She decided to piss in front of the imperial palace, which was an act of sacrilege. And this is an important point, because even though people might be, they might have devotion to the emperor or a particular system, they express these things in a way that often turns into defiance at a moment's notice. So, it's really appropriate that I'm spilling a lot of water, because the story that made Medoruma famous is a story called Drops of Water. And I was thinking about that story because that story, the memory of World War II, is really, really vivid. Because my grandparents also moved from Okinawa to Osaka during the 1930s. And my grandfather joined the Japanese military, and that experience in the Pacific War. The group discipline, if one person screws up, everybody gets beaten, having to drink piss to survive, being ordered to kill villagers, but he couldn't do it, and being shot and surviving, and that was a big trauma, and he lived with it for the rest of his life. And my father, at the same time, my father's Taiwanese, was jailed by the Japanese because he's a preacher, and the Japanese military thought because of his preaching, he was agitating against the Japanese. And he was put in a cell for a year and a half without any charges. But despite the fact that he was jailed, he learned so much from his fellow prisoners. He told me about an experience listening to a Buddhist priest, because he never encountered a Buddhist priest, and he learned about Buddhism, and also how to use a paper ecologically, a toilet paper, because there was none. So what you do is you fold the paper as you wipe your ass, and you fold it again, and you wipe your ass, and so you don't waste it. And you can actually clean up your ass, even though you have no paper in the prison system. So these stories, which might seem insignificant, stories that often are forgotten or dismissed, make a part of a very important texture and aspects of what Edward Thompson, Peter Linebaugh, and others have called history from below. So my own project is to try to find a way to recover this history into the history of the revolutionary Pacific. So I hope all of you in the audience and others who I will see in Okinawa later this month can help me. Thank you.